Okay, here we are beginning week 3. This is week 3 of World Civilizations to 1500. And tonight we're going to have 2 lectures. The first one is going to be on the first barbarian invasions into the Middle Eastern world. And the second one will be about the Hebrews. Again, we're looking, for last week and this week, we're looking at that Middle Eastern world that were the cradles of civilization for Europe and Asia. For your textbook today, you were supposed to read chapters 2 and 3, neither of which is precisely on what we're talking about, but there are portions of it, and portions of it will be for next week when we do China and India as well. In the global experience, the relevant primary sources are Hesiod, the creation, the Greek creation, and we'll be talking about that later, and Homer, the Odyssey. In the human record, we have the Rig Veda, which is an Indian creation myth, and the Odyssey. There's a selection from the Odyssey, and there is a selection from Zarathustra, who was a Persian a religious leader, and all of those will be relevant to the Indo-Europeans. Well, we mentioned 2 creation myths. We have a Greek creation myth, which is Indo-European. We have the Rig Veda, which is an Indian creation myth, which is also Indo-European. A creation myth is a recognition of man's separation from nature. When people write a creation myth, they recognize that they are human beings, that they are separate from nature, they are no longer part of nature, and what they want to do is explain where they came from and the origins of everything. And so almost every culture we'll look at will have a creation myth of some kind or another. And if you remember from last week, the Egyptians in fact had 3 different creation myths, and they kept all of them even though they contradicted each other, so that's kind of interesting. We also talked last week about Gilgamesh, a hero in a quasi-historical setting, an archetype, and here we might go to our pictures. Here's the title, World Civilizations, and this is a little preview of the Indo-Europeans, the first barbarian invaders of the Middle Eastern world. Here is Egypt and Mesopotamia that we looked at last week, and you can see Egypt along the Nile River and Mesopotamia along the Tigris-Euphrates River. We talked about those last week, and here they are in more of a close-up so that you can see both of the cultures that we looked at. And notice that the region, just the lower region of the Mesopotamia River Valley, is the region that we looked at last week. Here's a mound covering a portion of the ancient Babylonian city of Nippur, and so this is the Babylonian part of Mesopotamia. Gilgamesh was a hero in a quasi-historical setting. He was an archetype. He was a hero who represented everything that the Mesopotamians believed about themselves. And this is true not only of the Sumerians who wrote that myth, but also of those who followed them, the Babylonians, and then later the Akkadians who conquered that area. We have a similar character in Egypt. I read you the wisdom of Ptahhotep, who was an archetypical model for success. How do you reach success in the Egyptian world? And both of them are cultural archetypes that represent what they aspire to in that culture. They're projections of certain values that the people wanted to believe of themselves. And I have something interesting to show you. Here's an ancient Babylonian cedar or a machine planter, and again, this is the agricultural culture of the region. But here is an actual picture of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, a Mesopotamian representation of them. There is Gilgamesh on the left, fighting the bull of heaven. Remember, he killed the bull of heaven. And there's Enkidu in the middle, helping to kill the bull of heaven. And on the right-hand side, you see a lion fighting Gilgamesh. Remember, after Enkidu died, Gilgamesh went out in the wilderness and he wrestled a lion, and he was wondering, why we have to die and searching for the meaning of life. Well, there were several guises to Gilgamesh. He started out as a lusty young man and a warrior. And then, after Enkidu dies, he becomes a wanderer searching for the meaning of life and why we live and why we die. He ends the story as a builder, and he finds his meaning by subordinating himself to the community. Gilgamesh seeks, and he's looking for answers, and what he learns is profound truth. So the story of Gilgamesh is a story that everyone read in order to find the truth about the meaning of life. Gilgamesh was far more of a philosopher than other heroes. For example, Ptahhotep, who we saw as the Egyptian hero, was not a philosopher at all. I mean, he functioned very well. He was very practical in his advice. Gilgamesh asked religious questions, and we inherit, in the Western world, we inherit religious questions from the Near East. Both Egypt and Mesopotamia are theocracies. Here's a Sumerian cylinder seal, again showing the same types of characters. We inherit religious questions from the Near East, and both Egypt and Mesopotamia are theocracies. This is a Greek word. Theo means God. Krasi means power. It means all the power is with the god, who is the god of that region. Theocracy is a rule by a god, and the government is owned by the god. People believed that the state existed to placate the gods, and the primary purpose of the people is to represent the people to the gods. The primary purpose of the state is to represent the people to the gods. They believed that their government was owned by the gods, and this is true of both Mesopotamia and Egypt. Thus, there is no room for individual expression. Everything is for the sake of the gods. Everything was in service to the gods. We can make some comparisons between Egypt and Mesopotamia. Both of them grew up on rivers, and both of them were theocracies. But they're different. They're the same in some ways, they're different in other ways. In Egypt, the ruler was a god. The pharaoh was a god personified. In Mesopotamia, the king was the agent of the god. And this is the upper Nile River, as far as you can go to the first cataract of the Nile, going southward. And remember that there are differences between Mesopotamia and Egypt. In Mesopotamia, the cities were owned by the gods and people lived in them, and they were servants and slaves to the gods. In Egypt, the cities were ceremonial. Nobody lived in the cities, and they were only for worshiping the gods. And here we have two examples of Egyptian cities. Compare, and here's the Rosetta Stone. I wanted to show you a better picture of the Rosetta Stone. Remember, this is how we came to be able to interpret the hieroglyphics. Notice that the Rosetta Stone has 3 layers. The top layer is hieroglyphics. The middle layer is an Egyptian script, a hieratic script, and the bottom layer is Greek. And they all say the same thing, and this is how this is the key to understanding understanding hieroglyphics. Okay, compare, and here's Gilgamesh again. Okay. Compare the pyramid and the ziggurat. And this is the city of Babylon, and notice that the ziggurat is not in the center of the city, but on the side of the city, dominating the city, the biggest building in the city. The ziggurat was the home of the god on earth. It was the meeting place of earth and heaven, and it was the center of town life. To the question, why are we here? The Mesopotamians answered, man was created to serve the gods. And this is a drawing of ancient Babylon, and here we see an actual ziggurat in a photograph of a remaining ziggurat today. The pyramids, on the other hand, were tombs. The pharaohs were buried in the tomb, a center of death, and the pyramids were an enormous religious undertaking. The safety of the country depended on the well-being of the god and the pharaoh, and so this is why everyone was willing to build the pyramids as their service to society. Compare the concepts of life after death in the two societies. With Gilgamesh, in the story of Gilgamesh, the afterlife is a shadowy existence. Man eats the dust, and death conquers. Death is a horrible place to go when you die. In Egypt, we have quite a different contrast. In Egypt, Osiris becomes the god of the dead and the god of the people, and life after death is seen as very pleasant, just like this life on earth. The Isis and Osiris legend was a vegetation cycle, and to continue the story, the son Horus avenges Osiris. Remember, Osiris was killed by Set, his brother, who chopped him up and threw him all around, and his wife Isis put him back together again, and this is why plants are resurrected in the spring when everything comes back to life. Well, in the story, the son Horus avenges Osiris by killing Set, and this adds a sense of right or justice, which is called Ma'at. And so we sketched for you last week a pleasant world of Egypt and Mesopotamia, functioning very well, everyone getting along very well, especially Egypt was prospering. This idyllic world was rudely interrupted, violently interrupted by a set of barbarian invasions. The main invasion started in 1800 BC, but the movement of these barbarians into this Middle Eastern world happened long before that, 1,000 years before that. The movement started as early as 2700 BC, and it came from the Caucasus region. And here we see a world map. We have the actual invasions in 1800 BC, but the Indo-Europeans started on the move around 2700 BC. In the pink area there is the homeland of the Indo-Europeans. Now, there was quite a bit of debate and controversy among historians about where the actual homeland of the Indo-Europeans was. I'll give you some more details on that later, but now the consensus is this is the region that was the Caucasus, is the region of the homeland of the Indo-Europeans. They started filtering down into the Middle Eastern world as early as 2700 BC, and then we have an actual invasion about 1800 BC where they move very swiftly into the region. The invasions led to the displacement of peoples. As they moved down from that region into the Middle Eastern world, they pushed other people in front of them. So the first invaders into the Middle Eastern world were not the Indo-Europeans, but they were other peoples who were pushed into them by the Indo-Europeans. And when the Indo-Europeans, the barbarians, started moving into that area, they revealed the sense of permanence about states as an illusion. Before, Egypt and Mesopotamia seemed timeless and lasting forever. They had a very cyclical idea about life repeating itself with a yearly cycle over and over and over again. They had no sense of the past or the future, but rather they saw life as an eternal repetition of the cycles of the year. Now, this is interrupted. This is the permanence of the states is shattered, and there's a huge change. Whole nations of people are wandering aimlessly, and they have devastating political and cultural effects on the settled civilizations. And think for a minute, we have our settled civilizations. Civilized people aren't as good at fighting as barbarians, because barbarians are travelers and hunters and gatherers. They can be hunters and gatherers, they can be nomads and herders, but they move around and they're better at fighting. In addition, in this barbarian invasion, the technological edge lay with the invaders, and they had technology that the civilization did not have. This technology included the horse. They had tamed the horse, which did not exist in the civilized world, They had the spoked wheel, and they had bronze technology, the use of bronze. Okay, let's look at some maps. Here we see the Indo-Europeans. If you notice, the Caucasus area is in the pink. It's now extended into the area of Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey. And that's where the first Indo-Europeans moved into a rather empty land, and settled in Asia Minor on the fringes of the Mesopotamian world. So the first Indo-European kingdom was the Hittite kingdom that set up in Turkey. Okay, but you can see that the Indo-Europeans were travelers, adventurers, and wanderers, and they spread far and wide. You can see the purple arrows, they go all the way into Europe, and the green arrows there, they go to India, they go to China, they go all the way to Siberia, and they go to northern Japan. And so you can see that as they break up around 2000 BC, they move into all of these different areas where they upset the civilized world. Okay, they have the origin of the Indo-Europeans. Their breakup is around 2000 BC, and as I said, there are 3 sets of invasions. We'll get back to that in a moment. There are some articles on the origin of the Indo-Europeans in the New York Times of November 2000. There was an article on the origin of the Indo-Europeans, looking at the archaeology, genetics, and linguistics, all of those put together as evidence for the Indo-Europeans. And looking at the genetics, the genetic makeup of the Indo-Europeans has 6% of the very earliest settlers in Europe who settled there 45,000 years ago. And then there are successive waves of settlers, but the main Indo-European culture and the origin of the Indo-Europeans is the Kurgan culture, which spread the Indo-European languages. And Indo-European is a language grouping. It's not racial, it's linguistic. Spreading from the Ukraine to India to Siberia 5,000 years ago. Another interesting book on the origin of the Indo-Europeans is by Brian Sykes, The 7 Daughters of Eve. And what he argues in that book is that most Europeans can trace their roots back to 7 women who are genetically, according to the mitochondrial DNA, there are 7 Eves, if you want to call them that, who are mothers of the Indo-European stock. There was an interesting article in Politiken, a Danish newspaper in Copenhagen just last year, by an archaeologist who had been interested in Afghanistan, and he had, because it's in the news, and he had studied the artifacts, and what he argued was that Scandinavian origins were in Afghanistan, and he based that on the similarity of artifacts and sun symbols. And Afghanistan is roughly in that region of the Caucasus where the Indo-Europeans originated. So that's kind of interesting articles in the news. Here we have the dispersion of the Indo-Europeans from the Caucasus going in all of these different directions, which I mentioned to you before. And here is the Caucasus, if you can see that region in relation to Mesopotamia and Egypt, and of course they move into Turkey and then down into the civilized world. They bring horses. They tamed horses, and this gives them a tremendous advantage. Here we see Greek horses in a battle. They're warriors. They invented the spoked wheel, which they can use. It's much lighter than a wooden wheel. It can be used on these chariots, and so mostly the Indo-Europeans fight with war chariots of this kind. This is a Persian war chariot. And the Indo-Europeans, there are other pictures of them. The Hittites had war chariots, and this is what the Indo-Europeans brought into the region. It's a linguistic grouping, a language grouping, as we said. The Indo-European breakup was about 2000 BC, following the Hittites into the region of Turkey. The Hittites move in 2700 BC. There is another set of invasions from about 2180 to 2080 BC, and that corresponds to the Egyptian interregnums, and another one from 1600 to 1400 BC. The language groupings are here, some of them. There are many more: German, Latin, Greek, Old Persian and Avestan, East Indian, Sanskrit. We also can include Celtic languages. The Celts are Indo-Europeans, so Irish and Welsh are Indo-European languages. The Slavic languages are Indo-European languages, and we can see the relationship between these languages with the common words that are common to every language. Here we have brother, mother, and father, and you can see how similar they are in each one of these languages. Well, where did the Indo-Europeans come from? A common characteristic of the Indo-Europeans is to have a sky god, and this is because they are nomadic people. They herd cattle and horses, and so they move from place to place. They have no permanent place to live. They have a common word for father, mother, sister, and brother, and they've been thought to be a patriarchal society, but I'm going to sort of argue against that right now. They're not necessarily patriarchal completely, but they're pastoral and nomadic. They also have common words for horse, cattle, and pasture, but they have no common word for sea. And this points to their origin in the steppes of the Caucasus. There was some argument that they originated in Asia Minor, but I think that's been changed now. There was a new discovery of an ancient civilization in Bactria, or modern Afghanistan, where they had no written language, but the artifacts seemed to be Indo-European, and I told you about the Danish article in Politiken that was comparing especially the sun symbols of the Afghans to the early Scandinavian sun symbols. Also, Indo-Europeans were discovered in Western Mongolia, and there's a large article in Discover magazine, Discover the World of Science, April 1994. The title is The Riddle of the Chinese Mummies. What are 4,000-year-old Caucasians doing in Xinjiang? And so the answer is that the Indo-Europeans ranged all the way into China, and we know they also went to Siberia and they went to Japan, but they were Caucasians because the mummies were clearly Caucasians, and they were genetically found to be Caucasians. So here we have the waves of these Indo-Europeans, the Hittites going into Asia Minor. The ones who went westward were the Greeks, the Italians, the Celts, and the Mycenaeans. The Hittites moving into Asia Minor 2700 BC and setting up an empire there. Later, around 2100 to 1800 BC, the Indo-Europeans in the Caucasus break up, and we have those who go west as the Hittites, the Greeks, the Italians, and the Celts, and the Centomycenaeans. Those who went eastward were the Aryans, and those are the ancestors of the Indians who settled in India. The Aryans settled in India. The Persians, and if we look at our map, Persia is just before you reach India. So the Persians settled in Persia, and then you have India, and then that middle area goes to China, and then to Siberia, and Japan, where we have the pre-Turks and the pre-Japanese. Okay. And here are the three waves of movement. Again, 2100 to 1800 BC, I've just mentioned that Discover article here. Okay. In the west, the Mycenaean Greeks, the Italians, and the Celts. And then there was another wave, a third wave in 1200 BC, a later wave in the west where the Greeks, there are later Greeks who go, then the Germans, the Scandinavians, the Balts, and the Slavs move into Europe. Okay, so we have three waves of this nomadic culture. The yellow here is the Hittite Empire that they founded. And here we see the waves again, the Hittite Empire and the waves of migration. All right. The Indo-Europeans have several features in common. First, they're a warrior society. They're nomads. They herd animals, and they are warriors. They also have a king who is a priest rather than a priest who was a king. Okay. What this says is politics and government were more important to them than religion. And this is quite different because if we look at Egypt and Mesopotamia, the only important thing is religion. Interestingly, their king was not absolute like he is in Egypt and Mesopotamia, but he consults with the tribal elders, and if he's not a good war leader and not a good king, he can be deposed. He also has to consult with a council of elders, and so we have frequently in the Indo-European different cultures, you have a council of elders, and then below them are an assembly of free warriors, so that the warriors have a voice in the choosing of the king and in the making of war and peace and government. Underneath these three layers of culture, we have three layers: the king, the council of elders, and the body of warriors, the assembly of warriors. Underneath are the slaves that they conquer. Okay, the slaves are not necessarily Indo-Europeans. And in this culture, humans are important and not the gods. And so the gods have a lesser role to play than we've seen in Egypt and Mesopotamia. Another interesting thing about them is they are lactose tolerant, which is a genetic capability that they have cultivated, and it helps in their survival because, of course, it gives them more food. If they can eat the milk of their animals and the cheese and the other products of milk, then their survival rate is better. Okay, so these are the characteristics of the Indo-European societies. We can get a view of their religion if we look at some of the readings for today, the creation story in the Hesiod. We might take a note that Gaia, or Earth, is the creator goddess, and that there are many, many gods and goddesses. And one of the interesting things about the goddesses are, the gods and the goddesses are that often they represent human emotions or human functions within them, and they also contain just lots of gods and goddesses, but also nymphs and wood spirits that inhabit the woods and inhabit all of nature. We also have a reading. One of our readings from the Odyssey is Odysseus in the underworld. And you have a view of what the underworld is like, what they think of life after death. It is a cheerless gloom. The spirits who live in the afterlife, in the life after death, know the future, but Hades is the realm where the dead dwell as witless images of worn-out mortals. And here I'm quoting the Odyssey itself, saying what they call themselves. And one of the inhabitants says he would rather be a slave of a poor man than the lord of all the dead. So life is wonderful, and death is the end, and death is a bad place to go. So they're not happy about death. We also might look at this second reading of the Odyssey that we have. One is in the Global Experience and one is in the Human Record. The second reading of the Odyssey portrays the Indo-Europeans as strangers wandering around the whole world as far as they can go. They're travelers and adventurers and they're explorers. And this certainly does describe the Indo-Europeans. Okay. We look at the Rig Veda creation, which is another of these Indo-European creation myths. And we have Indra, the thunder wielder, who is the creator. He's kind of like Zeus. He's a thunder god, and you can almost draw a one-to-one correspondence between the Hindu gods in the Rig Veda and the Greek gods, which are also Indo-European. Indra is a creator, a conqueror, and a healer. He's also a battle god and a war god, and he's a sky god. And this is typical of the Indo-European gods. There's also a reading on Purusha, but he is a later creation after they settle in India, and we'll look at that next week when we look at India. Okay. Here is an ancient Hittite. In 2700 BC, the Hittites settled in Asia Minor, and they lived there for a very long time. For 1,000 years, they absorbed the culture of Egypt and Mesopotamia, and they adapt it to their own culture. It's not for 1,000 years later, from 1475 to 1200 BC, the Hittites actually form their first empire. They don't pull their government together into a unified kind of empire for 1,000 years. They adapt the civilized customs. They adopt writing, and they adopt the autocracy. Remember, their original culture is not autocratic, but they adopt the autocracy of the civilized world. But they maintain some of their Indo-European customs, such as oaths of allegiance to their kings by the subservient people. They also have laws of equality, and you have a selection of the Hittite laws to read. I'm sorry I didn't write that down, but there is a selection of the Hittite laws in one of your books. They pushed ahead of them other peoples, and let's look at some Hittite things. Here's a portrait of an ancient Hittite in a rock carving. Here's a Mesopotamian king, and so they adopted the autocracy of the Mesopotamian kings. And again, this autocracy, the bowing and scraping to the king, suing for peace, the Hittites adopted that. All right, around 1800 we see the first impact of the Hittites on the civilized world, and this is the domino theory. They push people ahead of them, and the people they push ahead of them are called the Hyksos. They're various peoples displaced by the Indo-Europeans, a motley group of various cultures that we can't really identify completely, but one of them is a group called the Habiru, and we think these were the Hebrews that were actually pushed into the civilized world by the Indo-Europeans. The Hyksos attack Egypt, and they take over the country, and this is the first interregnum in Egypt. They displace the pharaohs. The pharaohs are thrown off the throne, and remember that we have the nomarchs who rule in the chaos that follows. But in less than 100 years, the Hyksos were driven out of Egypt, and Egypt recovered, and the new dynasties of the pharaohs begin again. The new kingdoms begin. But the Hyksos and these invaders into Egypt enormously changed Egypt, and Egypt begins a new phase of its civilization. Okay. Egyptian imperialism begins as revenge for the foreign invasions, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Let's look at some pictures first. Here's the Hittite Empire that comprises Asia Minor. They also impinged on the Holy Land, which was later conquered by Egypt on this. Here is a Hittite city. Again, they learned city building from Mesopotamia, and they modeled their cities after Mesopotamia. Here's a Hittite inscription. They learn the writing. It looks like a combination, actually, of Egyptian hieroglyphics and the art of writing taken from the Mesopotamians, but they imitate the Egyptians. It's not Egyptian hieroglyphics. They use their own language. And here we can see a close-up of these hieroglyphics, which, if you look closely, are quite different from Egyptian hieroglyphics. Okay, here is the Egyptian Empire that was a response to the invasions. You can see that Egypt expands significantly beyond the Nile River Valley and all the way up the Holy Land and touching Asia Minor. This is the response of the Egyptians in revenge for the foreign invasions. And imperialism was successful. The Egyptians conquered large areas, fueled by success. and they gained increased wealth and power. We see trade begin for the first time, and we see a military theological complex which grew as a result. Now, never before had the pharaoh been a warrior, but now here we see the pharaoh who is in a Hittite war chariot drawn by a horse, and he becomes a warrior. And so we see a change in Egyptian concepts of the pharaoh. He's now a pious warrior fighting to protect the kingdom of Egypt. They have trade for the first time, and all of this trade is managed by the pharaoh. It's an imperial kind of trade. It's not free enterprise as we see in Mesopotamia, but it is a government-managed trade that's going on. This is the time of King Tut, who is one of these warrior kings, and here we see a picture of King Tut. But probably most important of all, one of the responses is slavery begins. There were no slaves in Egypt until we see the barbarian invasions, and once the Egyptians become imperial, we see slavery in Egypt. There was always slavery in Mesopotamia. In 1200 BC, there was a third wave of Indo-Europeans, actually the second invasion, but a third wave, more Indo-Europeans, and this is when the Greeks come in and invade. Earlier, the Mycenaean Greeks had settled in Greece in the first wave, but now we have another wave of Greeks, the Dorian invasions. In Egypt, we have more invasions by people called the Sea People, and these are the Philistines and the Phoenicians who move into this area. In Italy, the Tertia or Etruscans settle in Italy, and you can see the Philistines and the Phoenicians settle in the Holy Land. The pink on that map, the orange is where the Tertia settle in Italy, the purple is where the Greeks settle, and the purple far to the west are Phoenicians as well. The Phoenicians settle far to the west, okay, and in Libya. Now, with this final invasion in 1200 BC, the invasions stop, and we have the period of classical antiquity begins, and we have about 1,000 years of peace with no invasions in the Mediterranean world. Okay, let me show you some of these people. Here we see a close-up of the second barbarian invasions, 1200 BC, and you can see all of these different peoples. Here are the Phoenicians, who are the sea peoples, a Phoenician fleet, and now the Mediterranean is no longer a protection for Egypt, but rather the Mediterranean becomes a highway of invasion and counter-invasion and exploration. Here's a Phoenician garment that was adopted by the Greeks, and the Phoenicians seem to be half Greek and half other. We're not sure what they are. Here is Tyre, which is the major Phoenician city, the ruins of Tyre that are built, that are the center of the Phoenician Empire in the Holy Land. And here's a platter engraved with beaten work of art, beaten silver. And Nana, the Phoenician Astarte, is one of their goddesses, and here is an ancient comb, some artifacts of the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians are very important, as we're going to see in some of the other cultures. One of the things that happened because of the barbarian invasion was a new idea entered the Middle Eastern world that had never been seen before, an idea of a world empire, the universal state, and this is an idea of the Near East. Okay, the idea of world empire. The problem that immediately arose once you have an empire, a universal state, is how do you manage an extended state? Well, first of all, they learned from some of the earlier states that were smaller. There were local empires in Egypt and Mesopotamia that were precursors to a large world empire. Remember that in 2300 BC, we have the first Egyptian empire when Menes unified southern and northern Egypt. Again, the Egyptian state was based on the rivers. About the same time, in 2300 BC, Sargon of Akkad conquered all of the Sumerian cultures and unified that area. The Akkadians were Semitic, and the Sumerians were not Semitic. They were of a different racial type. In 1800 BC, we see another conquest of the Mesopotamian Valley by Hammurabi, who was a Babylonian, and he managed the unification of his state with a law code that unified everyone, a law code that governed everyone. And remember that the Egyptian empire was divided into nomes ruled by nomarchs. They kind of had states to rule each of the areas. And so we have some examples of how to govern a larger area than just a city-state. And here we see the Egyptian and Akkadian empires, which were local in nature. And here is a king of Akkad storming a fortress, the first unifier of the Mesopotamian Valley, and they preserved the Sumerian culture. Here's a winged lion in the time of Sargon. And here is one of the palaces built by the Akkadians, Sargon of Akkad. Okay. Now, the Assyrians then unified the whole area, and we see the first example of a world empire by the conquest of the Assyrians from 1000 to 600 BC. And they unified the area of the Holy Land. They were Semitic also, and they unified the Mesopotamian River Valley. They were also Semitic. Okay. Okay. And here we have the Assyrians. How do you manage an empire? What are the problems that are involved? If we look at that empire, what can you think of the problems of having a very large empire that's not unified by a river system? Notice that this supersedes the river system. So what are some of the problems that are involved? Yeah.
Would transportation of supplies be a problem?
Yeah, transportation and supplies, communication from one side of the empire to another. Okay, what are the other problems that are involved?
Rebellions. It's going to be really hard to send any military from the central, location or the capital to any of the outlying regions if there is a rebellion.
Yeah, simply control rebellions. That would certainly be something. How to govern it? How you would have to have a sophisticated bureaucracy to govern the region. So there are a lot of problems involved with governing an empire. Unification was brought about by the Assyrians and the Persians, and both of them were fringe states on the edges of the civilization area. The Assyrians conquered from 1000 to 600 BC, and they were Semitic. The Assyrians accomplished unification by the ruthless breaking down of nationalities. First of all, they moved great populations from one place to another. They picked everybody up and they moved them physically from their home states to make them assimilate into the Assyrian culture. They are remembered as being ruthless and savage, and the Assyrians are called the Nazis of the Middle East. And here we have some Assyrian soldiers fighting and Assyrian caricatures of dragons fighting. The Assyrians caused great suffering, but at the same time they were the great preservers of the Sumerian culture because they invented libraries and they saved all the Sumerian texts and they built libraries and put them in. Here we have some arrowhead tablets and inscriptions of the Assyrians. Again, they adopted the culture of the Sumerian River Valley. And here is Sumerian text, and this is about Ashur, their god. The reasons the Assyrians were so successful as conquerors is because for about 1,000 years the Assyrians were surrounded by enemies in a martyr state. They were a fringe state. And here is the Assyrian library text in the old Babylonian story of the flood in an Assyrian library. Okay. Here is Assyria, and it is the orange on this map. They were surrounded by enemies. You notice that they're surrounded by the Hittites, and the Hittites were a warrior society. And so for 1,000 years, the Assyrians spent their time fighting against the Hittites, protecting themselves, and they successfully resisted invasion pressures from all sides. They became so successful in resisting that they ended up conquering the whole area. Okay, they were turned into superb warriors by being close to another warrior society. And one reason they were able to conquer was because they practiced religious imperialism. They were harsh Puritans who adored their god Ashur, and they forced everyone to worship their god. Assyrian wars were crusades, and this is one way they unified the territory that they conquered, by forcing the subject people to worship Ashur. They also invented a new way of keeping the empire together by constructing royal roads, and that is how they connected their empire. They invented roads, okay, so that you don't have to use just the rivers. And they also had a system of messengers who traveled from one end of the empire to another. Okay, here is the Assyrian war chariot. They adopt the Indo-European war chariot, and they adopt it for their own use, and they begin the conquest of the area. Here are some Assyrians conquering, more Assyrian soldiers, warriors, and here's a battle in which the Assyrian soldiers are pursuing the enemy. Okay, here is their god Ashur, and you can see his symbol on the bottom. Here's a close-up of their god Ashur, who is a warrior god. Okay. And here is Sennacherib, an Assyrian king, who becomes a kind of tyrant, an autocrat who rules over everyone. Here's an Assyrian with an Aramean scribe, recording the captured Asiatic cities, and so they enslave everyone that they conquer and put them to their service. Okay, here's an Egyptian winged sphinx that's found in an Assyrian palace, and this is an Assyrian lion, Assyrian king, again, and some Assyrian art, which is extremely naturalistic. There's a hunt at the top and a dying lion at the bottom. It's beautiful and very realistic, naturalistic art. Okay, and here we have the conquered people suing for peace to the Assyrians. Here's an Assyrian palace. Again, they go beyond the building of the Mesopotamian river valley, and here is an Assyrian hero, a prince, and a princess, if you want to see what the people look like. The problem of organization: the Assyrians practiced calculated terrorism, and they built a road system and royal bureaucracy. In 950 BC, Babylon falls. In 671 BC, Egypt was penetrated, and in 612 BC, Nineveh in Syria falls. The Hittite methods of empire were overlordship, oaths of allegiance, and combined with Mesopotamian ideas of kingship, but they adopted much of the early civilization. The Egyptians practiced harmony and benevolence and bureaucracy. The Babylonians practiced law codes and judges. The Assyrians practiced calculated terrorism to unify their state. But they exhausted themselves after about 1,000 years, and power now flows to the Indo-Europeans. And the Indo-Europeans who conquered that area were the Medes and the Persians, who moved into that area. And here is the Persian Empire, which, when there was a vacuum of power as the Assyrians collapsed, then you have the flow of the Persians. The Persians were Indo-Europeans. These are the Iranians, modern Iran. Okay, the great conqueror was Kirush the Great, who ruled from 550 to 529 BC. The Persians then end up ruling all of Mesopotamia and Iran and Asia Minor. Kirush's son conquered Egypt. Okay, here are Persian soldiers. The Persians were celebrated for their army, and they were an Indo-European warrior society. But there was a shift in policy. The Persians used different methods to control their empire. They practiced reconciliation instead of terror. And if you look at the book of history that chronicles this period, which is the Bible, you can see that the Hebrews were ripped out of their land and taken captive by the Assyrians, but they welcomed the Persians because the Persians practiced religious toleration. The Hebrews viewed the Persians as liberators. The Persians used cooperation instead of coercion. Now, why might they have done this? Possibly because of Indo-European limited kingship. Remember that in our basic Indo-European structure, the stress is on cooperation between the limited king and his council of elders, and he has to answer to the assembly of warriors. So basic to Indo-European culture is a cooperative structure. The Persians may have been using a similar structure. Here is Kirush the Great entering Ecbatana as the conqueror, who is the kind and benevolent ruler. And here is Persepolis, which is one of the great cities built by the Persians. Here is Susa, another of the ancient Persian cities. Kirush the Great ruled from 550 to 529 BC as a great conqueror. His grandson Dariush I ruled from 522 to 486. He was the second founder of the Persian Empire, and he invented some of the methods of controlling such a huge empire. He developed a scheme of satrapies, and what he did was divide the entire empire into districts, satrapies, that were ruled by a satrap who was a local governor. Essentially, we have provinces of the Persian Empire ruled by local governors. He also copied the Assyrians by building a road system throughout this vast empire. And in addition, he created a system of spies to go out and check up for the king and come back and report to him. So now we've come down to 486 BC with the Persian Empire. And let me show you a few pictures. Here's the tomb of Kirush. We can see two different views of it, a drawing and a photograph. And here is the monument of Dariush. And this monument of Dariush is called the Rosetta Stone of Asia because it's a carving on a hillside done in different texts. And so again, we can learn to read these languages through this kind of huge Rosetta Stone that Dariush built so that all the people of his empire could communicate with each other. Here is another view of that Rosetta Stone of Asia. And here is the Persian language, the old Persian inscriptions. The Persians learned to read from the Mesopotamians. They learned to read and write. When they first invaded the area, they could not read and write. But again, they adopted the culture of the Sumerian River Valley. And it's that same Sumerian culture which is now enriching the Persian culture. Okay, here is the name of Xerxes in Old Persian cuneiform. Darius I was the second founder of the Persian Empire. I've already told you that. Now, this is the environment in which the Hebrews lived. Okay. The Hebrews, we're always told, invented monotheism. This is not strictly true. The Hebrews were not the only ones who practiced monotheism. Here again is Dariush. Let's look at Dariush conquering. There's a close-up of Dariush. Monotheism was a major development as a result of universal empires. People conceived of one God ruling over everybody and only one God. Instead of having a lot of different gods, the concept developed of one God responsible for everything in the universe. As I said, the Hebrews were not the only ones. As a direct result of the barbarian invasions, we see the growth of monotheism in Egypt immediately. Akhenaten ruled from 1369 to 1353 BC. He was contemporary to Moses, and he ruled right after the second barbarian invasion, or right at about the same time as the second barbarian invasion. Akhenaten, let me go back. Monotheism was a difficult concept, a very difficult concept to think of one God creating everything and in control of everything. Think about it for a minute. It takes a conscious denial of visual experience to attribute opposite tendencies to the same cause. Who would ever think in the normal world that fire and ice were caused by the same thing? Night and day, light and dark, and most difficult of all, good and evil, all having the same cause. And that's what monotheism requires you to believe. Monotheism is an abstract concept, and it took a long time to become established. Akhenaten was one of the precursors to the Hebrews. He predated or was contemporary to Moses in Egypt, and Akhenaten preached the cult of Aton, the sun god, and he worshipped the shining disk of the sun. So he saw the sun as a monotheistic god that ruled over many people, a recognition of the concept that one God spreads over many people. And in this new religion that Akhenaten developed, the concept of Ma'at, or justice, changed. There's an association of light with the perception of justice. So justice is light, and it comes from the sun. And interestingly, the art tends to be naturalistic. It becomes much more naturalistic under the rule of Akhenaten. It's a new departure, and what Akhenaten did was to persecute the other cults of the gods in Egypt. He tore down their monuments. He took away their money to support them because they had been supported by the state, and he substituted statues of Aton, his sun god, for all the gods of Egypt. Now, remembering last week's lecture and the Egyptians, how do you think the Egyptian people reacted to that? You're shaking your head. Do you want to tell us with your bite? No? How do you think the Egyptians reacted to Akhenaten tearing down the old gods and substituting his own god? What do you think?
They really weren't happy, and it ended up, him being overthrown and taken out of power.
Okay, well, the Egyptians hated that. Remember, they loved their gods. They never met a god they didn't like, and someone coming and overthrowing their gods, they were horrified. They were very, very upset. And so the cult of Aton, the monotheism that Akhenaten invented, it was a failure. As soon as he died, they overthrew the statues of Aton, they tore down his temples, and they reinstated their gods. Because to the military and the priest, Akhenaten appeared treasonous. He was destroying the state by tearing down their gods. So Akhenaten's attempt to establish monotheism in Egypt was unsuccessful. Why? Because it was contrary to the experience of the people. The Egyptians loved their gods. There was nothing wrong with their gods. Their gods were just fine the way they were. When Akhenaten died, the monuments to Aton were torn down and defaced, and he died in seclusion and besieged by everyone. Well, so that was the first attempt at monotheism. There was a second attempt. Here is Akhenaten. Here's a picture of Akhenaten. A second attempt at monotheism by Nabonidus, king of Babylon, and he lived from 556 to 538 BC. Nabonidus tried to install the cult of the moon god. He was a scholar, meant to be a priest, and he had an attachment to the moon as a monotheistic god. But this also went against the religious sentiments of the people, because one of the things he did was to abolish the New Year's festival. And remember how fearful of the gods the Mesopotamians were, and so that New Year's festival was a covenant with their gods every year, and so they were horrified to think that Nabonidus tried to suppress the New Year's festival. In 539, he was forced to restore it, and meanwhile he had withdrawn to his own city. And when Kerush the Great, the Persian, conquered Babylon, he conquered it without losing a soldier, because the city surrendered because Kerush promised them that he would restore their old gods. And so this was a failure. Nabonidus' attempt at monotheism was also a failure. In both cases, the new idea of monotheism ran against the religious experience of the people themselves. Okay, but there was yet a third attempt to create monotheism in the ancient world. Here we have Akhenaten and Nabonidus were unsuccessful, and this is a barrel-shaped clay record of the capture of Babylon by Kerush that says that it was surrendered to him without a fight because he promised to restore their gods. And here is the capture of Babylon by Kerush in this drawing. The third attempt was by Zarathustra or Zoroaster, and the date is not completely clear of when this happened. I've seen some dates dating him in the 600s, contemporary to Nabonidus, and the Zarathustrans, who exist to this day, date him to the 1300s, and they see him as in the time of Moses. And so we don't know actually when Zarathustra or Zoroaster lived. He's called by both names, Zarathustra or Zoroaster. We know about the religion from their sacred books. They have sacred books, the Zend Avesta and the Gathas, which have the religion written down in hymns and poems. And one of your readings for tonight is one of the Gathas, and I'll come to that in a minute. Zoroastrianism touched a deep chord in the Iranian people because the Iranians or Persians always fought the Tura, a nomadic tribe who was their enemy. And what Zoroaster did was identify the bad gods with the Tura gods. So all the bad gods are the Tura gods, the gods of their enemies. These are the Ahuras, the evil gods, and the Devas are the good gods. They saw Ahura Mazda as the god of good, the enemy of the Ahuras or the evil gods, and Ahriman or Angri Manu was the god of evil. So this is dualism. It's not strictly monotheism, but it's a dualism with a god of good and a god of evil. And this tells you how difficult it is. The idea of monotheism is to see the concept of opposite things having the same cause. And so here is the Persian solution to that. They also had an ethical concept, an ethical way of right living. This is called Arta, the right way. And it was never personified, but what it is the just way of life, how to live in justice, righteously, and ethically. If you follow Arta, you belong to the good gods, and you have complete freedom of choice. Human beings, according to Zoroastrianism, have complete freedom of choice. You can either choose to follow Arta and follow the good gods, or you can follow the bad gods. So Zoroastrianism is dualism. Zoroaster took Ahura Mazda, the wise god from whom all others flowed, as the chief god and made him the only good god, and Ahriman or Angri Manu as the opposing evil god. And he saw these two powerful gods of good and evil locked in combat with each other, eternally fighting each other, not eternally, but fighting each other. And this dualism explains the existence of evil and free will. Okay. Ahura Mazda and Ahriman were locked in battle, and at the great final battle, Armageddon, there will be a huge battle where the end will come, and Ahura Mazda will defeat evil. It's an Indo-European concept of the last days, and in this great battle of Armageddon, the universe is destroyed by the triumph of good over evil. And when the universe is destroyed, Ahura Mazda recreates it, and now it is a good universe. So they're striving toward perfection. And so we have the creation of a new universe after the destruction of the old one. Where dualism shows the difficulty of choosing between good and evil. The concept of the devil comes to the Hebrews from the Babylonian captivity. And I might mention a couple of other things. The dead were put in trees for the vultures as a return to nature, so they didn't bury their dead as everybody else did. They put them in trees, and the vultures consumed the bodies, and they consumed these very quickly. So here we have this dualism, and it's successful because this religion still exists today. And why was it successful? Because it's taken from the experience of the people. Okay, we have for our reading tonight, one of our readings tonight, the Gathas. And running through the Gathas very quickly and noticing some of the thing about it. Ahura Mazda is the creator god. And as you read the Gathas, you see there are rewards for good and evil deeds, so that the good are rewarded and the evil are punished. Good thought makes one prosper, and the devil or Ahriman, the enemy of good, is the liar. Zarathustra himself, the priest, is the foe to the liar and the friend to the righteous. May good thought give destiny to men according to their works. So right living is rewarded according to their destiny, according to their deeds. Ahura Mazda is seen through all his beauteous creations. How do we know what God is like? How do we know the good God? If you read the Gathas, you see that Zoroaster sees this good God in the beauty of nature, in the stars and the sun and the day and the evening and the light and the dark, and he sees Ahura Mazda as an artist creating everything that is. The evil God, the evil is lies, and the evil God is a liar. So as you read that text, I think all of that comes out when you read that. Zoroastrianism exists today. It's still in existence in the world. In fact, there was a Houston conference about 5 years ago, the 7th World Zoroastrian Congress. I have the news article here from that. 11 centuries ago, there was a diaspora, and the Zoroastrians left Iran or Persia, and they went to a lot of different areas of the world, but most of them went to India. There are a lot of them to this day in Bombay, and waves of them left repeatedly. This is largely because of Islam coming to Persia, and so the Zoroastrian religion, the traditional religion of Persia, was dispersed through a wide area of the Middle East. If you read it, you see there's an ethical code to it to this day, stressing good thoughts, good words, and good deeds, and human beings have free will to choose. The religion drives toward perfection. Another article in the New York Times in March 2001 chronicles some of the practices of the Zoroastrians, and particularly I mentioned the burial of they don't bury the dead, they put them in trees, in platforms in the trees, and there was a huge problem around Bombay because the vultures were disappearing, and they don't know why the vultures were disappearing, but it was a terrible problem for the Zoroastrians because they couldn't dispose of their dead in the way that they were used to, and so this ended up to be a big problem affecting the Zoroastrians there. interestingly, in the New York Times 2004, there's an article about the Taliban in Afghanistan. The Afghans practice the Zoroastrian religion, and even though they're Islamic today, a lot of the remnants of this Iranian religion of Zoroastrianism still survives. For example, they after the Taliban were gone, the Afghans celebrated the Zoroastrian New Year, which is called the Nowruz, which by climbing poles and celebrating and waving flags. It was the restoration of the old New Year's festival again that predominated in the entire Middle East, and so it still exists in the Afghan world to this day when the extremists are not in charge. So Zoroastrianism was successful. It shows how monotheism can be successful if it accords with the experience of the people. If the people can relate to the concept, it will actually work. And this is a result of monotheism developing in the Middle East, a result of the barbarian invasions. And so we've looked at today is the barbarians, the Indo-Europeans who invade the civilized world in the Middle East and the repercussions of that. We have new imperialism in Egypt. We have the idea of world empire and a world state unifying everybody under the same state. And related to that is the idea of one God ruling over everybody, over one people. Okay, we have about 5 minutes for any questions or comments that anybody wants to make before we go to our next lecture. Any questions or comments? Yeah, we've got one over here.
Out of the reading that Hammurabi code,
yeah,
it was kind of like eye for an eye.
Uh-huh.
I can't remember who they compared that to in the reading. It was another ruler. It wasn't so much as harsh as that or whatever. I can't remember which one it was from the reading, but it was another. They compared between the two, between Hammurabi and it was another.
How about the Hittite laws? Because another reading we had was the Hittite laws, and if you read the Hittite laws, you can see that they're extremely different from Hammurabi's code, and you can. Yeah, I think it was the Hittite laws, and the reason is because the Hittites were Indo-Europeans. They come from a very different basis than the Mesopotamians do. They're less autocratic. They're more cooperative, and they have a more balanced government where there are more participants to it than just an autocratic king. Yeah, well, you want to press your mic, okay?
Do the burial rituals of modern-day Zoroastrians in the United States differ, or?
I believe they do. I don't think they're allowed to put dead bodies in trees in the United States. That was delicately avoided. I actually went to that conference because I was so interested in the Zoroastrian religion, and they delicately avoided talking about it. But there's a very large colony of Zoroastrians here in Houston. There's a Zoroastrian temple here in Houston. The address is on the screen if you want to see it. Here's the address, 8787 West Airport Boulevard, and I didn't get a picture of it because it's a modern building, but they do have a Zarathustra Heritage and Cultural Center, and they have a large library if you're interested in investigating more about the Zoroastrianism. And, you can do this as one of your extra credit choices. You have in your syllabus a whole list of various places you can go in Houston, cultural centers, whether they're Indian or Chinese or African or Indian, American Indian, and this is one of your choices you can do for an extra credit if you want to go visit this place and have a look at it and read some of the things in their library. So it's quite interesting. I mean, Houston is a large center of Zoroastrians. It's just kind of interesting. Any other questions or comments? Okay, we'll take about a 15-minute break, and when we come back, we're going to look at one of these groups of barbarians who entered the Middle Eastern world, another group, and these are the Hebrews. Okay, so we've looked at the Indo-Europeans, we'll look at the Hebrews next.